In any recognition event, the selection of the award winner begins with the consideration of number of candidates or nominees. CAST is fortunate each year that we receive many nominations for this award, each of which would be deserving in its own right. The responsibility for naming the winner is taken very seriously by the selection committee, which is made up by the CAST board of directors, comprise this committee, that they carefully evaluate, review, and discuss all of the nominations that we receive, and they go through a fairly strenuous and rigorous process to really come to ultimately who we name as the winner. The announcement of this year's award winner was actually made earlier this year in April in an event we held in USDA. Many of the nominations that we receive come from our member societies, our professional associations, corporate members. Others come from individuals and colleagues. The University of California, Davis was the nominator of this year's award winner. With us today to introduce this year's award winner is Dr. Ermeus Grabab, Associate Dean for Global Engagement at the College of Agriculture and Environmental Sciences at the University of California. So, Ermeus, please join us to introduce this year's winner.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Frank Mitloehner. Dr. Frank Mitloehner is a professor of air quality specialist in cooperative extension in the College of Agriculture and Environmental Sciences at the University of California, Davis. He's making a difference nationally and worldwide in how we view animal agriculture, its effect on greenhouse gases, and its role in nourishing global population. I think I'm pressing something here. Okay. Dr. Mitloehner, he earned his master's in animal science and agricultural engineering from University of Leipzig in Germany, and his doctorate in animal science from Texas Tech University. In 2002, Dr. Mitloehner was recruited to UC Davis to fill its first faculty position focused on the relationship between livestock and air quality. His determination to mitigate air emissions from livestock operations and his study of the health and safety of farm workers and neighboring communities have had long-lasting benefits for agriculture, the environment, and the related industries. And his current focus is on the critical food challenge that he believes will become a larger reality as the world's population is projected to grow nearly to 10 billion by 2050. Dr. Mitloehner is a prolific author, a dedicated instructor, and a highly visible member of his professional community, and he serves on a number of influential committees. For example, he was a chairman of the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization Partnership Committee called Livestock Environmental Assessment and Performance Partnership, which is also called LEAP, whose purpose was to establish the global gold standard for assessing the environmental footprint of livestock production. Not only was the objective achieved, but under Dr. Mitloehner's leadership, 5 major guideline reports were published and released. He also served as a member of the National Academy of Science Institute of Medicine work group that authored a report, a framework for assessing health, environmental, and social effects of the food system. And he advised former President Barack Obama on food security issues, environmental impacts of food production, and other related issues. Dr. Mitloehner has been actively engaged with many of our nation's major livestock, feed, and rendering industries, and he helps organizations through extension services and strategic planning. He has given more than 800 invited presentations to a wide range of audiences, national and internationally. He contributes often to stories in the major mainstream media outlets, such as CNN, PBS, Newsweek, the Washington Post, and others. He also maintains a regular presence on Twitter and recently launched a blog designed to educate and inform a diverse online audience. Dr. Mitloehner is dedicated to sharing his knowledge as broadly as possible to provide science-based evidence on which to base long-term strategies. His ability to distill complex scientific information into everyday language through various platforms for the benefit of the wide variety of audiences sheds light on his popularity as an instructor, researcher, and media spokesperson and indeed shows he's worthy of recipient for the 2019 Borlaug Task Communication Award. And he's not just a good communicator, but he's a very good colleague as well. I remember I started UC Davis about 10 years ago, and he came to me and asked me what I needed. And if you've been to Davis, it's very difficult to move around without a car. So I asked him, I really need to buy a car. So he set aside his very busy schedule, and he took me to car shopping. And I just moved from Canada. I didn't have any kind of credits established here. So I was able to buy the car. So he bought the car on my behalf. So, but I was a little bit concerned. A few weeks later, he came up to me and asked me, how am I enjoying driving his car? So, so I mean, legally it was his. He could have taken it, but of course he didn't take it. So I'd like to invite Dr. Mitloehner to come to the stage now. Thank you.
Dr. Mitloehner, on behalf of the CAST Board of Directors and our sponsor, CropLife Foundation, very pleased to present to you the 2019 Borlaug CAST Communication Award, and present you with the sculpture. And also, we have with that, because this is a custom-made, authentic sculpture, we have the certificate of authenticity and also the stipend for the award. So thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to be here. Ambassador Quinn and Secretary Haig, family Borlaug, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, first of all. What a wonderful day of my professional life to receive an award that was dedicated in the honor of Norman Borlaug. I'm truly honored. Before I get started, I just want to thank CAST. I want to thank the CropLife Foundation. I want to thank those colleagues at UC Davis who nominated me. And of course, I want to thank my family, my dear wife, Jin, who is here with us today. And I know that any success that I have is made possible by all of those supporting and working with me. So thank you, first of all. It is with great gratitude that I'm here today. I'm fully aware of the talented and well-regarded professionals that have received this award in the last decade. This award is possible because of a community made up of people like you who truly value that authentic and accurate information is being communicated. My job at UC Davis is to generate information, to do science, but it's also to teach in the classroom and to teach beyond the classroom in the real world. That can be with numerous audiences, or it can be with online audiences as well. It was about a year and a half ago that people asked me, Frank, why are you not on social media? Why are you not on Twitter? And at that time I thought, you know, that's just not me. What can I say in 280 characters that's meaningful? I was wrong, and I changed and entered the social media world, and I'm glad I did, because now I reach hundreds of thousands, if not in some cases millions of people in a period of a month. So it is a new world that we are dealing with now. And I think it is of utmost importance that we really engage with thought leaders, with the public at large, and not just with people in agriculture, about those challenges and opportunities that we face in our sector. So with that, I want to start my presentation. I was asked to give about a 25-minute overview, and that's all it will be, an overview of some of the challenges the way I see them. challenges and opportunities. So the title of my talk is Feeding the World Without Wasting It. And that's really what we are confronted with. In fact, my first tweet 1.5 years ago was on that very topic, the 2050 challenge. And I actually talked about Norman Borlaug in that tweet. And it is really dear to my heart. And I can tell you, when I teach at UC Davis, my 300 undergraduate students, it gets them to the fronts of their seats. That millennial and that Generation Z is really energized when they hear about the challenge that lie ahead of us. And some of those I will talk about. Now, my talk will also just first briefly reflect upon some of those issues around climate. It will talk about more generally the 2050 challenge and then how agriculture can address some of those challenges. So again, if you do want to follow me, that's my handle here, GHG Guru. I also have a blog. And just a few words here on, first of all, the overarching issue of climate. Now, most climate scientists will tell you that climate change is real, and they will also tell you that human activity has something to do with it, namely the release of so-called greenhouse gases. And when we look at our world from space, when we use satellite images, we see that not just over the poles, like in this case the North Pole, where ice caps shrink, but also throughout the world we see distinct changes happening. And some of those changes are believed to be the result of greenhouse gases, such as CO2, methane, nitrous oxide being released. These gases retain heat from the sun, solar radiation, solar heat, and they retain it. And they also function as a blanket. So you can imagine these greenhouse gases forming a blanket, keeping the heat, the solar heat, in our troposphere. And the more of these greenhouse gases are produced, the thicker the blanket becomes, the more heat is retained. And that's what we have been seeing, particularly over the last few decades, that more and more of these greenhouse gases are amassing, keeping heat back in our troposphere. And normally, 3 greenhouse gases are being discussed. And you see them here, CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. And most people, when discussing those gases, limit their discussion on the so-called global warming potential. I don't want to bore you with great technicalities, but what I'm about to say, I think, is very important. Those gases don't just differ with respect to the so-called global warming potential, which is the potency of those gases to trap heat and retain it. But these gases also differ with respect to their lifespan. 2 of these 3, namely CO2 and nitrous oxide, are so-called long-lived climate pollutants, and that means once they are in the atmosphere, they stay there for 1,000 years. But methane, the Achilles heel of animal agriculture, methane has a lifespan of approximately 10 years. It is true that methane is almost 30 times more potent than CO2, but the lifespan is only a decade. And that makes a big difference whether a gas has a lifespan of 1,000 years, which means any kind of CO2 human activity has ever released is still in the atmosphere today, and it's additive, versus methane that's being generated on the one hand, but also destroyed, a process called hydroxyoxidation. On the CO2 side, you see at the bottom panel here the years 1750 to 2000, and the blue line indicating when throughout that time fossil fuel, meaning oil, coal, and gas, was extracted from the ground where it was stored for a long time and burned. So in other words, that carbon that was stored in the ground for a very long time had been extracted over 6-7 decades and then released into the atmosphere. So that carbon is now no longer down there, it's now in the atmosphere, and every time the sun hits it, these molecules heat up. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the reason why the vast majority of climate scientists in the world will tell you that the #1 human activity generating greenhouse gases is the use of fossil fuels, the use of oil, coal, and gas. However, a growing number of people, whether they make a business or have some kind of agenda, will tell you that they think the #1 reason for greenhouse gas buildup is agriculture, particularly animal agriculture. And I have a beef with that. This slide here is an important one, taken from one of the most recent National Academy of Sciences reports. It shows that methane, in contrast to, let's say, CO2 or nitrous oxide, is not just generated, produced, emitted, but it's also destroyed. You see here that the methane, the global methane budget, on the one hand, shows emissions, which are sources emitting this gas, like fossil fuel, or agriculture and waste, biomass, and so on. And all of these combined emit approximately 560 teragrams. 560 teragrams. That's how much methane is produced globally. But what most critics don't say is that methane is not just produced, but on the right side here you see total sinks. It's also destroyed, and not at a minor rate. I just told you it's emitted at 560. It's destroyed and put into the ground at a rate of 550 teragrams. So the net emissions of methane globally are not 560, they are 10. This gas is produced and it's destroyed. The destruction process is called hydroxyoxidation, as I said. And what that means is that once a methane molecule is in the atmosphere, sooner or later it will meet a radical destroying the methane. And that is part of the story that you generally do not hear in the reporting out there. You only hear emission sources and particularly focus on agriculture, and you do not hear what happens to that molecule once it's out there. Really briefly, I take you back to your high school years. What does a plant need to grow? It needs sunlight, it needs water, and it needs CO2. The carbon in this CO2 sooner or later becomes the carbon, namely the carbohydrate, in the crops that the animals eat, whether it's grasses or corn or others. That carbon from the atmosphere goes into the plants, becomes cellulose, and is then ingested by a ruminant, for example, which will then belch out some methane. That methane will stay in the atmosphere for approximately a decade, after which it's converted into CO2. And that CO2, actually a lesser amount of CO2, is a result of the hydroxyoxidation compared to the amount of CO2 that goes back into plants. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, the carbon that cycles through the system, the so-called biogenic carbon cycle, is just that, a cyclical movement of carbon from atmosphere to plants to animals to atmosphere to plants to animals. And this is what puts cows, let's say, into sharp contrast to, let's say, fossil fuels, which were in the ground for a very long time, oil, coal, and gas. We extracted and burned that carbon, and then it becomes atmospheric carbon. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the main reason for increasing rates of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. Never compare cows versus cars, or risk of being deceiving, deceptive, and incorrect. What does the EPA say about what the main emission sources for greenhouse gases are in a country like the United States? You see here on the left side 3 of the main culprits, namely the transportation sector, power production and use, and what's called industry, mainly the cement industry. And these 3 combined, transportation, power production, and industry, these 3 combined are all fossil fuel using industries, amount to approximately 80%, 80 that is, of total greenhouse gases in the United States, 80. Then you see agriculture listed here at 9%. While they depict agriculture with a cow, this is not animal agriculture, this is all of agriculture. All of agriculture combined emits 9%, animal agriculture alone 3.9%. Let's call it 4. So those people who say that livestock emit more greenhouse gases than the transportation sector generally use a global comparison. By the way, that one is flawed as well, but it's particularly flawed when used in a country like this one. The 800-pound gorilla, and there's no question about that, in a country like ours, is the use of fossil fuels. But that's not to say that agriculture does not matter. We still emit about 4% in animal agriculture and 9% in agriculture overall. And this is the focus of my program at UC Davis, to reduce those parts of greenhouse gases that stem from animal agriculture. So now I announced that I'll talk about the 2050 challenge, and I will here now. You see the years 1750 to 2050 depicted on this slide on the x-axis. On the z-axis, you see the total amount of people in the world. I just turned 50. When I was a little boy, we were right here at around 3 billion people. Today, we are up here at 7.6 billion people. And by the time I'm an old man, we'll be up here at 9.5 billion people. Or in other words, and that's a take-home message for my talk, throughout our lifetimes, human population on this planet will have tripled. We will have 3 times more people on this planet throughout our lifetimes. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the challenge of our lifetimes, namely how to provide enough food to provide this growing global human population, on the one hand, without depleting our natural resources that we all depend upon. That's the challenge of our lifetimes. My 20-year-old students in Animal Science 41, they get that right away. They also see the other challenge here, namely that there are 2 colors. The one is orange, and that shows the human population development in developed countries, such as the Americas or Europe, whereas in emerging and developing countries, depicted in blue here, human population is going through the roof. Not only because families are large, but meaning babies, but also because, and particularly because, of increasing life expectancy in these countries. Where people grew to be 60 in the past, they become 80 today. Okay? So, and that cumulatively means more mouths to feed globally. So, how do we address that challenge is the question of our lifetimes. A couple of my favorite slides. This one here shows a satellite image of the world and a circle over Southeast Asia, which contains more people in it than the rest of the world combined. More people live inside the circle than outside the circle. Clearly one of those areas of food security for the years to come. But it's not the only one. In fact, while South and Southeast Asia will increase by 41%, Africa will increase human population by almost 50%. 50%. The Americas, as you can see here, are not a main area and focus of the 2050 challenge. We are pretty stable in the Americas. And Europe, as you will see here, will even shrink. So the 2050 challenge really is one of an increasing population affecting particularly parts of Asia and Africa. This slide here from a German publication, that's why the words are spelled so weird, shows that parts of Asia will increase quite drastically. Bangladesh, India by about 1/4. But those areas in Africa depicted in red will increase their population by over 100%, meaning in 10 years, in a decade, they double their population. And every decade, they double their population. And that is a massive challenge, okay? So just take this slide in and remember where those spots are globally, where food security will play so prominently in the future. Many people say that in a country like the United States, we overeat meat drastically. Never have we eaten more, for example, beef than today. Well, this slide here shows the years 1909 on the left all the way to 2015. And it might surprise some of you that beef consumption in the United States has not really changed between 100 plus years ago versus today. An increase of 0.6% over that time. Total red meat has even decreased, but the big winner here clearly has become chicken. Yes, it is true that we eat more meat, but what we really eat more of is not beef or red meat, and that's what many people claim is such a big challenge, but it is poultry. But while our changes here are relatively modest, consumption of animal-sourced foods, particularly in developing countries, is increasing. Consumption of eggs, meat, milk, all of that is going up in those developing, emerging parts of the world. This is a development that's largely driven by incomes. On the x-axis, you see the per capita income. On the y-axis, meat consumption. As you can see, the more disposable income people have, the relatively higher is their meat consumption. With us leading the charge here, European countries following, and then most developing countries being over there to the left. You can see currently China is still all the way to the left, but make no mistake, within 10 years, they'll be probably leading the charge. Okay? Well, of course, African swine fever will have an impact on this whole development, but there's no doubt that Asia will play a very dominant role. This slide here shows one of the major challenges as I see them, global cropland. Whether we have 3, 7, 9, or 12 billion people in the world, that's the only land, the only cropland in the world we have to feed those people. Allow me to show you a depiction that I think is powerful. Imagine this regular sheet of paper here being the surface of the earth. This is the entire surface of the earth. I now fold this sheet of paper and I will fold it twice. Until it's 1/4 its original size. And what you see here now is the total amount of land in the world. The rest is water and ice. This is all land. This here is just a regular business card. And the equivalent amount of land of this business card is the total amount of agricultural land in the world. So this here is all land. This is all agricultural land. This is how little we have. And now I will take this business card and I'll fold it into one piece that's 2/3 and the other piece 1/3 its original size. And then I rip my own business card into pieces. So this here is all agricultural land. And the larger the 2/3 piece is all agricultural land that we call marginal land. It's called marginal land for a reason, because either the soil is not sufficient to grow crops or there's not enough water. Hence, marginal land. What do we do with that piece of land today? We use it for ruminant livestock. Because only ruminant livestock can be used here, because what grows here is cellulose-rich material, non-human edible. Monogastrics can't ingest it, but ruminants can because of their unique microbial composition of their digestive system. 2/3 of all agricultural land are marginal, can only be used with ruminant livestock. And the remainder 1/3 of my business card, ladies and gentlemen, 1/3 of my business card is what we call arable land. This is the land where you can grow crops for people or for animals. That's how limited we are. The 2050 challenge is a tripling of human population throughout our lifetimes. And always think of that business card comparison, because that's how limited we are. In other words, we have to bring to bear all means necessary and possible to enhance agricultural production while not depleting natural resources. And this truly is a challenge of our lifetimes. This slide here shows one of the great challenges of society. We always think of agricultural production as being a main challenge around our food supply chain. But it is actually food waste, food loss and food waste that seems to be the greatest environmental challenge of our food supply chain. This slide, ladies and gentlemen, shows that 40% of the food grown in this country go to waste. 40%. And what I find unbelievable is that this number seems to hold true not just in developed countries like the US, but it even holds true in developing regions, say Africa. But there, for different reasons, there they might not be able to get the harvest off the field transported to distribution centers and so on, refrigerated, preserved. That's where their food losses occur. But in a country like ours here, food losses and food waste mainly occur at the consumer level, at restaurants or at our homes. 40%. Clearly one of those areas where we can make major changes. This is an important slide. It shows the relationship between total greenhouse gas emissions on the y-axis versus dairy cow productivity on the x-axis. And so what you see here are cows producing little milk versus cows producing a lot of milk, and their carbon footprint on the y-axis. Each dot here shows a country throughout the world and its dairy population. And what you can see here is that there are many countries where dairy cows produce dismal amount of milk. Very little amount of milk. We're talking about 2, 3, 4,000 pounds per cow per year. We would call these cows here idle cows because we feed them, we treat them, and so on, but they produce so little milk that we would never be able to sustain such production here. But there are many countries where these so-called idle cows exist. These animals are kept alive, they get just enough nutrients to stay alive and produce a little bit of milk, but nothing to really speak of. And as a result, these countries have very large herds of livestock to produce the amount of food people require. And then you have countries, and by the way, the US is not on this slide because we fell off. We are someplace here right off the slide, where productivity is very high. And as a result, we were able to shrink our herd sizes. And this is a very important concept, that the more productive you become with your herd, the more you enable a country to shrink its herds. And if you shrink herds, then that means you shrink environmental footprints. It's that simple. This slide here shows greenhouse gases from animal agriculture, that's methane and nitrous oxide, in developing countries on the left versus developed countries on the right. This is not at all finger pointing at any individual region or so. This is just saying, look what an opportunity we have to further reduce global livestock impacts. Because while in developed regions of the world, we were able to produce record amounts of food while plateauing with our greenhouse gases, in developing regions of the world, the increasing demand is met by increasing livestock herds. And this is a situation we don't want to continue. We want to get the left side of this to be just like the right side of this. And that doesn't mean CAFOs everywhere. That just means sustainable intensification throughout agricultural production, in this case, animal agriculture, throughout the world. This is the challenge of our lifetimes in animal agriculture. This slide here from the FAO shows carbon footprints of dairy production around different regions in the world. And you can see here North America is not what many people or outlets depict us to be, the main polluter, but we actually have the lowest carbon footprint of any dairy production area in the world. And what I also want to point out is these three columns here. And if you look at who they are, where these regions are, and you think back to the slide with the population increase, then you will see that these overlap. The areas in the world with the greatest increase in human population are also the ones with the lowest productivity. And that makes those regions really the focus of the 2050 challenge. There is just no doubt about it, that we must assist these regions in becoming more efficient, or else there will be a major, major mess on our hands. In other words, what Norman Borlaug did, the Green Revolution, did not really work all over the world. There were some areas in the world where it wasn't, where it did not take place, and Africa is one such place. And I actually want to encourage us to think about a green revolution for those places, because it's being called for. So, how did we arrive at a situation where some parts of the world have a relatively low environmental footprint per unit of production, whereas others don't? Well, there are four main tools. We have improved reproduction per animal, per livestock herd. We have installed a veterinary system, which means we have learned to vaccinate, prevent diseases, but also treat them. And we have improved genetics, while at the same time feeding more energy-dense diets. And the combination of those factors has allowed us to shrink herds and flocks to historic lows. Never before have we had smaller herds and flocks in a country like this than we do today. This is an example for beef here. You see in orange, slaughter numbers have gone down pretty drastically. We have shrunk our herd size. From the height in the 70s with 140 million beef cattle, we are now down to 90 million. So 50 million fewer cattle today than in 1970. But we are producing the same amount of beef today as we did with this much smaller historic herd. Look at this. Numbers of animals went down, but productivity went up, and drastically so. This year's pork production. We have tripled pork production since the 1960s. We've tripled it. On the dairy side, we used to have 25 million dairy cows in this country. Today we have 9. We went from 25 to 9, but with this much smaller dairy herd today, we are producing 60% more milk. 25 to 9, produce 60% more milk. And that has shrunk the carbon footprint of our dairy herd in this country by 2/3. That is a truly astounding accomplishment, one that I never see reported in the media. And I'm wondering why. Why is nobody talking about that? This is not some PR stunt, ladies and gentlemen. This is the truth. And this is what we need to achieve globally, because we have no alternatives. Some people think we need to go back to the 1960s, to the red barn, all animals on pasture. That is not the case. In fact, that would lead us to disaster. To go back to slow-growing chickens is a nightmare, because we would have to double our flocks. Who wants that? Who can possibly want that? Who understands the environmental impacts associated with that? But these are some societal drivers out there, and if we don't watch it, then some people will enact them. By the way, I just told you we have 9 million dairy cows in this country today, right? Does anybody here want to guess how many horses we have? We have 9.5 million horses in this country, more horses than dairy cows. And by the way, we have 170 million dogs and cats, eating the equivalent amount of nutrients as 70 million people. All right? Of course, nobody talks about horses, cats, and dogs, because they are our buddies. But everybody wants to focus on our cows. Well, anyhow. So my wife always says I'm the greatest source of useless information. And I just proved that point. That's what wives say, right? Keep us on our toes. This slide here shows what I think is really important to know, namely farm inputs versus outputs over time. On the x-axis, the time. And then you see total farm inputs. And as you can see, in the United States, they have remained pretty steady. Whereas total agricultural output has gone drastically up. That, ladies and gentlemen, is sustainability, okay? We have to do more with less. And if we don't learn to do this globally, we will have a train wreck. We know how to do it. We have to make sure that we have the social license to continue it. Because there are many people out there who want to take that social license away. They say whatever we do today is wrong. We should go back to the 50s or the 60s. I have news for them. Not just are we not wrong, we are the envy of the world in how we produce food in this country. And we better tell our story and tell it right. And I'm not talking about PR. I'm talking about fact-based information that we must get out in a credible way. In summary, like it or not, a majority of, let's say, animal-based emissions today occur in developing countries and are a result of low efficiencies. We know that we can reduce emissions both from animals directly, called enteric emissions, but also from their waste. Whether it's emissions to air, water, emissions affecting climate, we can achieve drastic reductions. They are both necessary and they are feasible. We know that technologies and regenerative practices hold the key to environmental mitigation. We must ensure that we continue to have the social license to use those technologies. And this is a statement that I heard at the FAO level, the Food and Agriculture Organization at the United Nations in Rome. Production intensity and emission intensity are inversely related. That's a mouthful. What it means is when productivity goes up, emissions relatively go down. The population overall does not understand that if you explain that in that context. They will understand it if you explain it in a, let's say, fuel efficiency context. They will understand that their car today is more fuel efficient than their parents' car or grandparents' car was. And more fuel efficient means you still drive 100 miles, but you do it with half the amount of gas. And if you do so, then you produce much less emissions. That's what the public will understand. And if we use analogies, they will really get it. It's time for us to explain the way we do agriculture in ways the public understands. Because currently, they do not. They do not. It's not because they are silly, it's not because they don't care, but because they just don't have that mindset. So with that, I want to, in closing, thank you again for this very prestigious award. I'm truly humbled. I want to dedicate this award to my late father, who instilled in me the love for the spoken and written word. The challenges that come from the work in this space of science communication are large, but I'm truly encouraged by your generosity, and I know that together we can meet that challenge. So thank you very much again, and I hope that you have a great rest of the event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank, for your comments. Again, congratulations on being our 2019 Borlaug Cast Communication. We look forward to working with you to enhance communications about science and technology and bring many of the factors that you identified in your talk to the public. And with all of us collectively involved in science communication, we can make that happen.